Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It always goes into full screen. Hold on one second. Sorry. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's workshop, which is Strategic Visioning, Create the Future You Want for Your Organization. I always get goosebumps when I say that because it makes me feel really hopeful. Just a note, we will be recording this session and we will be providing the link to this recording after the session to all participants. My name is Yvette Bello. I'm representing the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. With me today is, to make this a great webinar experience, is Betsy Johnson and Monica Kelly from the Hartford Foundation, and our co-host, Daniel Alexander from the Hartford Public Library. This workshop is brought to you by a partnership between the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and the Hartford Public Library. So welcome today. We want to know who you are, so please take a moment to share your name and organization in the chat. We always like to see who's in the room. In terms of questions, we do ask that you remain muted. This presenter has asked that questions be asked as they arise. You can unmute and ask when he pauses for questions, or if you feel more comfortable, you could put your question in the chat, and I will do my best to lift those during our question and answer times during this session. There will be a break. We have built in a break during this session. It's about an hour in or so. So you will have a chance to take a break. But as always, if you need one, take one. That's okay too. We will be having a survey at the end of this session. It'll pop up when sort of in the final stages of the session. Please take a moment to provide us feedback. Let us know if you like it, like the session, want to hear more, have other ideas of topics we should present, and whether or not you like this via Zoom. It's always helpful to know. So please share your thoughts. Now, my favorite part, introducing you to our presenter. Today's presenter is Roosevelt Smith of Roosevelt Smith Consulting. Roosevelt Smith is a seasoned consultant, facilitator, administrator, with proven success in supporting nonprofits in startup, transition, and capacity building phases. In his 28 years, he has led organizations, provided consulting and training services to nonprofits in the areas of strategic planning, organizational assessment and development, board governance, retreat facilitation, executive transitions, coaching, and leadership development. Just reading that off makes me so tired. But he does it all. I will note that he's also his work also has included large, small, and volunteer-run nonprofit organizations in a wide array of mission areas, including youth development, housing, human services, human rights, social justice, environmental justice, food justice, and the arts. So all the good stuff. He's been in all these sectors. Roosevelt is also a trusted consultant for the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving's Building on Success program. The Building on Success program is a 2-year cohort-style program that focuses on supporting smaller nonprofits in their path toward increasing their own effectiveness in their core functional areas. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Roosevelt. Take it away, Roosevelt.
Thanks, Yvette. Again, just grateful and appreciative of you, the foundation, Daniel, the supporting staff, Monica, Betsy. Yeah, just always think about coming into these sessions. You all make it so easy to show up and be with folk to do this work, right? And the more and more of these I do, the more and more familiar faces I get to lock in and see. So welcome to some familiar faces that may have attended a different session and or that I'm working with currently. Always glad to be in the space with you all. So this greeting that I use may feel a little bit repetitive, but this is how I enter space. This is how I show up to do this work. And so I greet you all in the Zulu tribe tradition of Sawubona, which literally means I see you. But it's a more substantive greeting that also extends the greeting to also say I appreciate you, that I recognize and acknowledge this moment and its importance of being with you, right? You have choice, you have agency. You chose to be here, which means you could have been somewhere else. So I really am appreciative and thankful for you all, what you do, how you show up day in and day out with the very important work that all of you do, the amazing work that all of you do. And I recognize your own brilliance, right? Your own expertise, your own lived experience. And so all of that is integral into this meeting. It is not, our typical, hi, how you doing? No, this is, hi, I see you, I welcome you, let's get to work. So Sal Bono, I appreciate you all. I thank you. And I look forward to today's conversation. For those who are just coming in, as I see folks still arriving with us, I think we anticipate today being a large group. Just to reiterate, if you didn't hear, I encourage you to chat in who you are, what organization you represent, shout yourself out. And in addition to that, we're also going to do a quick poll just to kind of see where you are on the continuum. Are you a founder, a ED, a board member, et cetera? So just to give us a sense of who else is in the room. So Daniel, if you want to launch that poll, and then we'll continue our conversation. Let's see, what are we looking like? A lot of board members, a lot of executive directors, staff too. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thank you. And again, we encourage you all to take a peek in the chat as well. Maybe there's some sister, brother, cousin organizations that you can are interested in connecting with. And so we encourage you to see who's in the space, who's sharing the space with us. So we appreciate you all both chatting in and using this poll. So it looks, final numbers are, that we're kind of three-way tie, equal board members, executive directors, and staff, and appreciate the one volunteer. You're just as important in this work as well. So thank you all, appreciate that. So what are we here to do? What are we here to discuss today? I want to start this off by sort of setting some context, right? And looking at this slide, and just reading off of it, right? It's hard to imagine a future when we are overwhelmed with the present and or continue to dwell in the past. Why? Well, the world continues to change faster, but our ability to keep up hasn't kept pace. So while we're stuck in the feeling of being overwhelmed and or holding on to the past, the world keeps moving, right? Things keep happening. The volatility, the uncertainty, all of those things are happening around us, right? And so one way to think about that opening line, and let's just play. I'm in a playful mood today, so I'm going to ask those of you who are on screen, let's play a little bit. So I want to give you a sense of kind of what this feels like. So if you can take your hand and put it in front of your eyes and bring it as close to your face as possible without touching it. As close to your face, keep your eyes open, as close to your face without touching it. Now I want you to think about it, actually, what can you see? What can you see, right? And now I want you to slowly begin to move your hand away from your face, gradually. And notice now what you're able to see. Keep going until you're far enough from your face where you can almost see everything in front of you. Excellent. Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, others, for participating. What that quick exercise, what I'm trying to do with that is give you a sense of what I mean by perspective. When our perspective is hand in front of the face, we are overwhelmed by putting out the fire of the day, chasing the crisis of the day, doing whatever is the emergency calling us to do, right? going from meeting to meeting to meeting, that is the perspective of being overwhelmed in the present. Equally, some of us may have a different perspective. If we are sitting in the past, what we used to do, what got us here, right? It was great back when, right? This is how we show up and do this work. Things are changing, but we're struggling to meet that change because we're stuck in the past. That's also equal to that hand being right in front of your face. And so what we need to do is gain perspective. And that is equal in that exercise to moving the hand or move away from, right? Gaining some space, some distance in between you and what you're dealing with in the day-to-day so that you have perspective, right? So I'm hoping, my intention is that today's conversation allows us to gain some perspective in the context of accomplishing in the future, regardless of the changing circumstances, uncertainty, and instability, what you actually want to do, right? And I want to try to introduce a way in which you can practically do that, right? Without creating more burden, right? Without creating more time and attention taken away from, what's important, right? So we have to figure out a way how to integrate what I'm going to frame as strategic thinking, strategic visioning into our day-to-day conversations and planning so it doesn't feel like we're loading up for one single event, if that can make sense. So our agenda for today is we'll get through this open and welcome. We're going to spend some time with mindset. As you can already tell, that's the starting place, right? Then we'll look at some quick definition and terms so that we're in this conversation speaking and meaning the same things. And then I'll introduce some curated frameworks and tools to help you practically go about doing this. And then we'll wrap up. Any questions? You can throw them in the chat on any of that. Does that make sense? Are you down to play? I see some nods. Excellent. Great. All right. So when we're thinking about mindset, we're actually going to do just a quick breakout group. And it's going to be fast. And all I want you to do is just to embrace these questions, think about them, and talk about them amongst your group, right? What we tend to say about our organizations is indicative to how we think about our organization, right? And so I want to start when we're in this place of mindset, just to give you some reflective time about how are you thinking, or how did you think about your organizations, right? So the 3 prompts quickly are, what conversations did your organization start with? And again, this is to the extent that you were around or you heard. This is how we got started and what those conversations were like, right? What conversations are you having now, right? About your work, about where you want to go, about what you're doing, what you're not doing, et cetera. And then I want you to think about, are today's conversations helping or hurting your organization? That may put you in a little vulnerable space, and hopefully we'll all respect all of our vulnerability. We're not perfect. We show up and we do the best that we can, and so it's okay. We can be challenged by how we're framing the work, again, given by what perspective is in front of us. So play with those 3 questions. We're going to break you out into groups, give space and time for everybody to go around, and then I'll bring you back and we'll see kind of what bubbled up, what you heard, what you thought about in those conversations, and then we'll move forward. We ready, Monica? Great. All right, excellent. Back. Thanks. So how was that? We're gonna do this just quickly, popcorn style. Again, I appreciate you're willing to play with sort of the speed dating format, but the intention really was just to get you thinking about these questions and begin to talk about them a little bit out loud, and to hear how other people, other groups, other organizations have had similar conversations or are thinking about it. So who'd like to go? Just anybody can share kind of what were some of the conversations, what were some of the common themes, different ways that you talked about you all's work in these different questions. We have space for a couple of folks to go. And then again, I encourage you, if you're not comfortable or don't get an opportunity to say it, out loud, you certainly can use the chat, and Yvette is monitoring that as well. So who like to jump in and share?
I'll share. I will.
Go ahead, Rosalind.
I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
It seems like that we were pretty much on the same line as far as increasing our structure of our organization.
Okay.
And that was pretty much the consensus all around. And even myself, I just gained some information. I'm always listening. So one of the persons in our organization did speak to that they do work in that line as far as a consultant to help with strategic planning and startups and for small organizations. So that was good. And we are, as our organization, we are having a lot of conversation because we're moving into purchasing a building. So
great. Okay.
We got a lot going on.
There you go. There you go. So just even hearing that, thank you, Rosalind, for sharing, right? Even beginning to get conscious and aware of the language we use, right? So we're throwing out these words, strategic planning. Okay, what does that mean, right? Increasing structure. Okay, what does that mean, right? What we're calling ourselves, small startup organizations. All this language is indicative in terms of how you see and think about your work, right? And again, no right or wrong, no judgment, but they're indicators, they're windows into what you're talking about and how you're holding this work, right? So thanks, Rosalind, for sharing. Who else like to go? I see a hand up, Karen, just because you're on my screen. So jump in, Karen. There you go. Hi.
In our group, we had 3 or 4. I don't know who. There was one person who actually their organization was maintaining more of a strategic focus, and they were including the constituency they served. They're on track. Where the others have been more caught up with the day-to-day, and of course the COVID pandemic crisis has added a huge wrinkle, and everybody's moving forward. 2 of the organizations were performing arts, and they had to sort of backtrack, rethink how they were going to respond, what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, how they were going to raise money, because we all took a great hit. So we went from maybe having some forward thinking and thinking strategically about where we're going, and having to pull back and now get that hand much closer to our face. Because we have to respond to what's in front of us right now with this crisis.
Thank you. Great report back. And you know, it's interesting. So I'll just quickly share. It's not my favorite book, but it's the title, my favorite title of a book. And it's by Peter Block, who is a consultant guru to nonprofits. And the title of the book is The Answer to How is Yes. I love that title. Because sometimes we ask, and I'm not suggesting that this is the case for the groups you talked about, but sometimes we ask the how question too soon, right? So one of the reasons why, and I'll put this in context of our questions, if you think about some of the conversations you had when you got started, my guess is that there was somehow, but a lot of it was like, let's get started, let's jump in, let's try stuff, let's play, let's figure it out, right? Let's react and respond to what's in front of us. And then you go about that work, right? And then we get a little further, we get a little bit mature, and then we look up and we say, oh, maybe we should begin to put some more structure to try to control and command our direction a little bit. Maybe we're reaching out for funding and the funder's like, oh, do you have a strategic plan? And now we're like, oh, what is that? Should we now start that conversation? And then that's when you begin to sort of think about how, right? And that's a good place, but sometimes that how then paralyzes you, right? And you lose sight of the energy and the playfulness, right, that happens in those earlier life cycles of your organization. So again, no right or wrong, no judgment, but I want you to just think about and feel the difference of kind of where you started, where you're from, and then how you're talking about your work now. Is it hurting or helping? I think we got time for one more. Who else like to go? And or Yvette, if you're seeing anything in the chat.
I'll share one thing that someone actually brought up in our
yeah.
group. I thought it was great that I think it was you, Susan, who said, you know, the pandemic, and she said it inadvertently, but it was something thing sort of just that made note for me when she said, you know, the pandemic allowed her small organization just of herself, who's the full-time staff, to then take a challenge, to then expand her reach, because now she's doing sort of tele support via, you know, sort of online as opposed to just simply in person. And in that sort of small statement, it just sort of reminded me that in the challenges, there are often opportunities to really then expand our visioning and so forth.
100%. Thank you for adding that. I'm gonna, and I tend to try to stay away from jargon language, nonprofit speak, but there's a term that I just read. I think it was in a Harvard Business Review, which is why this term, but article, and they mentioned this idea of what is it called? A catalytic mechanism. And so if you think about, if you have some sense of your current reality and you have some sense of where you want to go, and then we tend to frame strategic thinking and planning as, well, how do you connect those dots, right? What are the steps you can take to get closer to where you want to be? Sometimes what gets missed is the jump starter, the motivator, right? In this Harvard Business Review article, the catalytic mechanism, right? That thing that says, well, if I commit to this, if nothing else, it's going to force me to take a next step, right? And so I'm hearing some of that, Sherry, when you say like the pandemic caused us all to rethink certain things, recalibrate, right? And then depending on what perspective, what mindset you brought to that conversation and discussion, for some, they used it as that catalytic mechanism to take a leap, right? To take a next step. So I'm just introducing that into conversation in reaction to what I'm hearing. So all great. Glad that you all hopefully enjoyed that experience and took something from it. And again, just to conclude this component, right? The types of conversations that we are having about our organization serve as a window, right? To how we're thinking about our work and our organization in time and space, in the moment, right? And so these conversations and our thinking can drive our ability to achieve success or not, if we're not paying attention to them, right? So these subtle things, and I didn't hear any of these, but just to throw out some other things that maybe folks didn't get a chance to share, like we seem to be talking a lot about strategic planning, but we can never find the time to do that. That may be a way you're discussing planning, right? Another frequent question of that I'm hearing in this time and space is, how do we get to the next level? Assuming there's a next level to get to, right? What did you do coming into? How did you get to where you are? Is there an opportunity to invest, pour in, and leverage the strengths, ideas, abilities that you've already built up to propel you to the next level, right? What's another one? We've always done it this way. So these are folks who are at that point. Change is forcing them maybe to look at things a little bit different, and they're stuck in that old way of thinking. So these are some other ways of, more so from a negative side of some of the conversations that we have that can prevent, right, our ability to move forward. But all of this rests in this area of our mindset. So I like to start there, right? So here in this next slide, I want us to encourage you, right, to think about, to expand your mindset a little bit further, right? So there's this quote, in the carriages of the past, you can't go anywhere. And what I take from that, or how I like to say it sometimes, is what got you here won't get you there, right? So wherever you are, if you're trying to get to another place, well, then we need to do something different. That's how I come at strategy, right? Strategy is this opportunity to say, here's the things we were doing, and I'll define strategy a little bit more in detail a little bit later, but we've been doing these things, and guess what? We realized they got us to a certain point, and maybe they no longer work, right? Or we're starting to feel that stretch or need to do something, and that becomes the hard thing to do, to let go of what no longer serves your organization to get it to that next level, right? And so this idea of what got you here won't get you there depending on how you're defining there, right? Now, the other way of thinking about that is if you haven't quite defined where there is or what you want to be, then you can operate sort of in this status quo mode, right? So it's easy to stay in status quo if you haven't given yourself a direction, a place to go, a somewhere to get to, somewhere to aspire to, whatever that looks like for your organization, right? So all of that is encouragement to, if you change your thinking, you can change your language. And in changing your language, that now may serve as impetus for you to now change your behavior. So when we go from, we always find ourselves talking about planning to what do we need to do next step? What's the next elegant step we can do to plan for our organization? That's a difference. Now we're not just talking about planning, we're actually setting ourselves up by how we're talking about it to take a next step, right? Maybe that's gather more information. Maybe that's figuring out what stakeholders we want to include. Whatever the steps are, small, big, in between, right? Changing your thinking changes your language, which then can serve as an opportunity to change, right, your behavior, what you do. Another way of expanding your mindset is introducing this concept of what is possible. So in our work, and I dare say this in front of our host, one of our foundations, but there's a lot of talk in the nonprofit sector about what they call outcomes measurement, right? Or evidence-based practice, right? And I think there's a healthy conversation to be had around that, and we should be trying to capture that information and learning from it. But sometimes there isn't a response, there isn't evidence, right? There isn't a best practice. And when you come back down and you say, well, what is possible, right? And that's, where do I want to go, right? Where can we go? What is possible? So introducing that thinking in the context of strategic visioning and planning is a different way, because now we're trying to imagine ahead of the evidence. The evidence may not be there yet that we can actually get there, which means what is required? Faith, right? And this is where faith lives in the organization. I started 2 nonprofits. I cannot, in both cases, my motivation wasn't because there was evidence that I would be successful. My motivation was because I sat down with young people and they were talking to me and they spoke to my heart. And I showed up to say, okay, then we need to do something. Let's do it. Let's figure it out. And my confidence grew because when I threw out the invitation, kids showed up. And then we began to build from there. So that is sort of an example of what imagining, right? Before there's evidence, just showing what is possible, asking that question, what is possible without evidence? What is possible if we choose to dream, if we choose to declare, if we choose to listen or and bring up what we're experiencing in a day-to-day, whatever's related to your mission, your cause, the work that you're doing, and say, for that reason, I'm here, I'm devoted to this work. And so now let me think about what is possible without the evidence. So again, in this creative space, I look at strategic visioning and thinking as an opportunity to do creative thinking as well as analytical or cognitive thinking, right? But I like to put the creative thinking first, because then I can let go of all the inhibitions, the limitations, all those things that you all, that perspective that keeps you in front of your face. It's just giving you a moment to say, well, let me remove that for a second and let me think about what is possible. Now I bring back the reality, and we'll talk about how you now work between those two. And then obviously, we just don't want to be in dream space, right? We want to turn those goals, visions, aspirations into results, right? So again, reframing, I'm not just talking to be talking, right? I'm talking to actually move a step closer to generate results, right? Now, those results may not be the quick leap to that vision. It just may be a small step, right? I think one of you was sharing in the refocus, in the reimagining with the pandemic, now we're thinking about who should we be talking to? Can we use this opportunity to re-engage our stakeholders? Who are our stakeholders, right? How are they doing during this pandemic? When's the last time we've been in touch with them, right? Are we seeing a drop or an increase in how they're showing up, right? What can we glean from that, right? So again, it's moving between we imagine to now, okay, what are we gonna do? And then all the while, and I just added this bullet because it's something that I've been practicing and learning, and we actually were talking about a little bit when you all were on break. The older I get, the harder it is for me to think about things in that sort of linear time. So if I can't attach a moment, a space, an experience, a feeling to time, it's getting hard for me to remember, like, yeah, what was I doing in 2010? I couldn't tell you. But I could tell you what I was doing in 1994, which was launching an organization, right? I could tell you what I was doing in what, 2004, 5, right? Was launching a practice, right? Of becoming a consultant, right? But now what I've been able to do to help me mark time is to curate, to journal, to record, to be creative. So I look at art much differently. Art speaks to me in my 50s now in a much different way than it ever has, right? So I bring art into my PowerPoint presentations. How does that make us feel? How does that generate and motivate, right? I journal and write things down all the time. I read a lot, right? And so I'm grabbing things and putting them in this sort of ongoing archive and record. Why is this important? Because sometimes we forget. And as we lose memory of what we were doing at a particular time, go back to that first question. What conversations were you having at the conceptual phase? Sometimes it's good to connect to that because the energy, not necessarily what you were doing, but the energy, the experience is enough to now propel you past that day-to-day, that block, whatever is holding you, right, in the moment that you're in. Right. So all of this is a frame. I won't go into this art piece, but you have it, you can look at it. It's just framing a way to come at creative space and thinking. Be vulnerable, play, explore, make mistakes, communicate, grow, escape out of, right? Change. How do you look at change? It's a process, right? We move, we evolve, we do things different, we learn more, right? So all of these things are just slight plugs to help you expand your mindset as we think about strategic visioning and planning. Let me pause. Questions, comments, thoughts on any of that. And again, if you want to unmute yourself or you can throw something in the chat. Any thoughts, any comments? I see some heads nodding. Okay. All right, I will move on. Yvette, anything in the chat? I'm not really looking at it.
It's, well, Nick is saying this is excellent. So
Thanks, Nick. All right, well, let's move on. I'll take that cue as to move on. So now I'm coming kind of from the high 30,000 foot. Now we're gonna drop down a little bit, right? So this whole conversation, we framed it as strategic visioning, but what's implied in that is there is a planning component. What you may find helpful, right, is just to visit with your team, your staff, your board, your volunteers, your other stakeholders. Yeah, actually, how do we think about planning? What do we actually believe? And here's just some prompts, because you'll be amazed that we make a lot of assumptions. And in those assumptions, we never check in until there's tension. And oftentimes that tension is just because we're actually having two different conversations because we have two different perspectives. We're talking about planning, but for example, someone may be of the mindset, yeah, you actually can predict the future, right? We can designate right now what we want to be doing 3 years from now and then get about that work. Where others are like, I don't know. We don't do very well in prognosticating and predicting the future. And so now we're at tension, right? So someone who wants to stretch and be extremely visionary versus someone who is more anchored in, let's say, reality, for lack of a better way of framing it, that may create tension. Well, how do we absolve that? Both thinking is helpful, but we need to know when we're doing it, right? We need to know what are some of the thoughts you have. Some other ones, right? Do we approach planning by saying we intend to do what we say in our plan, or we actually pretend we know where we're going just so we can set out on the journey? Just so we can say, you know what? The ultimate destination isn't as important for us right now. We just need to get going. So let's create a vision. We're not necessarily married to it, but let's just say it so that that allows us to take the next step, right? And so again, these are just prompts that you can use, right, with your team once you begin to think about planning. And you'll be amazed, right, of some of the assumptions that maybe you've been making to then check in to say, oh my God, like maybe we are in agreement, but maybe we're not. And this is helpful. Maybe this helps me expand my thinking, right? Maybe we can figure out what's, and here's a question I've added. When we look at these as sort of polarity questions on one end or the other, maybe there's some meeting space in the middle, but oftentimes a good question to ask is what's required in the moment. So sometimes we can be in a place where what's required is that sort of, yeah, what is our reality? What do we need to do in the immediate? What needs to take primacy? Like that sort of logical thinking, linear, step-by-step approach, brick by brick. Other times it's like, you know what, we got into a place, we want to get to a much bigger place. We need to be willing to let go, right, of what we've done unto this point and imagine what we could do different. That puts you in a different creative space, right? And again, both things can be true at the same time. It's just who's holding the perspective. And so what I like to do is check in. When I'm invited to do strategic planning now, I start here, or this is one of the places I start. Well, before we do any work, let's talk about how we actually think about planning. Let me get a sense of that, and you'll be surprised. A lot of times folks haven't even slowed down enough to even give it any thought. They just know it's something they should, or they've accepted that it's something that they should be doing. They were either told, right, or they looked out and they saw another organization. So they're comparing to another organization, say, well, they have a strategic plan, we don't, we should get one. Let's do it. Thoughts, questions, comments on this idea? Paradox of planning is what it's called. But again, it's just another way to expand your thinking. Does anyone have any favorites that they're willing to share? Where do you find yourself in somebody? If we just, let's stick with this first bullet. Do we believe? Can we predict the future? We can't predict the future. Is it useful to pretend we can predict the future? Does anyone want to share kind of where they fall on that in those three questions? You all don't want me to call on people, do you?
I'll raise my hand. I don't think
Okay.
I would fall in, we can't predict the future.
Okay. Okay.
And I would
Okay.
fall in the space of saying we in fact can, because to much a degree, we have control over that based on all the things you've been saying before, as far as what we think about, what we talk about, and then how we put that into action is then, it's innovate. In my mind, that's innovation in and of itself. Sort of, you think about it now, you can predict it and then take the actions to make it so. So in essence, you can see it, so you can in fact predict it.
Yeah. And I think to Rosalind's point, right? Like, imagine, I use this as an example. Imagine if you just completed your strategic plan, let's say January of 2020, right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, right? We couldn't predict necessarily those circumstances. And that may cause you to almost look at your strategic plan in a whole different light, right? And so again, both things can be true, right? Both perspectives are helpful. And I would say more importantly, the more you can have that divergent thinking and you can go back and forth in what's needed, the better your outcome can become. Because what you're forcing yourself to do is stretch your thinking beyond just how you hold it, right? And we're including the thoughts and inputs of others. And then you land at a place where maybe one is more of the other, or it's just a happy meeting in the middle, right? We do a little bit of both, right? In this exercise or in this frame, we need to be creative. We need to be predicting of, right? In this thing, we need to be a little bit flexible, right? Or fluid or adaptive, right? These are all words that are buzzing around us, right? Because that gives us space to turn on a dime if we need to, because we can't predict everything, or the world doesn't operate on our timeline, is how I like to say it, right? And so both things can be true. So thank you both for sharing that. So moving on. So I just want to kind of run through some quick definitions, and then we'll go into a break. So this is how I'm holding some of the things as we go into this conversation. So already I've really, if you've listened, right, been stressing these words: strategy, vision, planning, right? So here's 3 definitions. They're not the only, right? But they're 3 definitions that I like to use in this context, right? So how do we think about strategy? So oftentimes I ask that question and I'll get everything. Well, it's the goals and objectives. And actually, it's not quite that, right? Well, it's the actions that we take, maybe, right? Or someone will give me some other answer, right? So here's how I want you to think about strategy. And this comes from David LaPiana. He's written several books. You can look him up and you'll see some of this work, right? But he talks about, in the context of nonprofits, strategy is a coordinated set of actions. So if we take all the actions and how they're coordinated, aimed at creating and sustaining, and I put this in brackets because he would use a competitive advantage. And I know sometimes when I come into spaces, I'm okay with that word, but I know in the nonprofit space, many of you are not, right? And so I've reframed it as distinctive, right? What is distinctive about your organization? So you don't have to necessarily be in competition, but you should always be pursuing what's distinctive. So creating and sustaining a distinctive advantage in carrying out the nonprofit mission. It's a lot of words. So let's break it down. Coordinated set of actions. So it is action oriented. We're not just pie in the sky thinking. Strategy is about what actions are we going to take. And those actions should be aimed at creating and sustaining a distinctive advantage. What is it about our organization? What is it about how we show up? What is it about the learnings, capabilities, experience that is unique to us that we bring to this work? Starting there, not what someone else is doing, not who's considered best in class in our field. You can do that after. That should be part of the work, but that's not a starting place. I strongly encourage, and I love engaging in detailed, sometimes very rigorous conversations with my colleagues, other consultants, because they challenge on that, or I'm challenging them on this very notion, right, about best practice. Before we get to best practice, how about we help the organization understand what's great about them? How about we help them understand and name what's important about them? So that strengths conversation takes on a whole different light, right? If you want to take it further, and sometimes we say, well, strengths we also call sometimes assets. So now if I slip into my economic training and role, what happens when we invest in assets? They actually begin to produce results. They then compound on themselves. They then create more opportunity. But it starts with knowing what assets you have and what assets you're working with, right? And so I really stress this distinctive advantage. And then those things should be carrying out, right, in alignment with pursuing the impact that you want to have, which is usually articulated in our mission. Any questions on strategy, what it means, how it resonates? And again, it may be the first time you've heard it said in this way, right? We can get lost in how things get framed, or overly use words that then lose their meaning. So I always like to go back and say, let's actually figure out what that means. And let's get shared understanding so that then we can leverage and move in a way that's consistent with the meaning. Next one, vision, right? So vision is a short phrase describing the future you are ultimately working towards or trying to create. Sometimes it's framed as a destination. So vision I hold in two ways. There's the metavision. What change are you trying to do as a result of your work, right? So I hope to impact the community in said way, right? I hope to create opportunity in this way, right? I hope to move the universe in this way. That's high level, right? But we use vision to sometimes describe that. Another way we use vision is, what is your organization doing between now and some point in the future, right? What destination do you want to create for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? We sometimes use vision in that way, right? What gives you a visual in your imagination, in your mind's eye, of where you want to be at some point in the future? That directional focus. We know we want to go right, which means if we're saying yes to going right, we're saying no to going left, right? So that visual representation that can provide directional focus or a destination is hugely important. That's how I use vision in this conversation. And it's both meta and then for your organization. Sometimes you'll see language that kind of combines both. Completely up to you. No opinion on how you use it or all of that, but I just want you to get understanding of what purpose it serves. And then lastly, planning, right? So I like this definition because it outlines planning is a process, not just an event. It's a process of deciding in detail how to do something before you actually start to do it, right? So planning becomes the process that you set a vision, you understand your current reality, where you're starting from, and you begin to develop actions, goals, objectives to get you from one point to the next. That's all strategic planning is. So now the question is, how can we kind of collapse that and shrink that to do it in a way that doesn't overburden your organization, right? That doesn't create this big pause. I would say on average, and Yvette, I don't know if you all collected any data. On average, when I'm called in to do a strategic planning process, we're looking at least 6 to 8 months. 6 is like really pushing it. That's like, folks, put it this way, in a 6-month process, we're meeting at least twice a month, just to give you some understanding of the type of ongoing activity that happens. 8 months or more is usually, and I've been in some that lasted 1.5 years, almost 2 years. Right. And so again, I'm acknowledging that for small organizations who don't have those resources or time, that may not be your reality. Doesn't mean you can't do it, doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Right. So here's a version of how you can go about that. Any questions on any of these terms, strategy, vision, planning, or anything before we pause for 5 minutes and go on a quick break? Yvette, you seeing anything in the chat? Is this resonating? Is this making sense so far? All right.
Seeing some positive remarks in the chat. We have a question: how many people that you could accomplish something in 6 to 8 months? So I guess how many people does it take to do that? Is that what we're asking, Cynthia? Yeah. To do a strategic plan.
So I think, so I'll answer it by asking sort of different questions, right? I think the first question is, it's less about the number of people and how I think that question is, I try to make a balance between what I would frame as the select few, those who can commit to that, which is generally a small group, showing up in a 2-week process regularly, consistently, so we can move the process and conversation going forward. what is required then, so that's the select few. But it also, part of our early conversations is then, how do we involve the broader many? So whatever your stakeholder groups are, additional board members, additional staff or volunteers, additional beneficiaries, people who benefit from your work, if you call them beneficiaries, clients, whatever you call them, the larger community. Then what happens is, okay, who are those folks, right? What is their interest in being in a process like this? And I use power. What power or influence do they have on the decisions that we make? So when you plot that interest and power, right, on a T-chart, right, folks who have high interest and high power or influence, we want to include them also in a regular way. They may not be as frequent as the select few who can designate that time and energy to a process like this, but we do want to create, maybe they're coming in once a month, right, or whatever is required. So I can't put a number on it, but I can try to answer in a way to help you think about, it's not so much the number, it's what you have, what's available, right? But holding both. We're definitely going to need a smaller group to move this thing along, but we should be tapping in to gain information, insight, and feedback from a larger group. And we shouldn't expect that larger group should be involved at the same level, right? And so you can have different levels of involvement depending on interest and influence to your decision making. And then you may have an even smaller group, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people, right, who are showing up bi-weekly, month to month, whatever's required to move the process going. They're kind of the holders of the process. They're that quick check-in of, okay, what does this mean? They're helping with the meaning making of collecting information, et cetera. Does that answer your question? Hopefully. Great. Okay. Any other questions before we go in the break? Oh, actually, I'm moving faster than I wanted to. So let me introduce this one more slide. So, and hopefully you all have this in the materials, but this is just some language on what makes a great strategic vision. So when we combine strategy with vision, right? Strategy, that collective set of actions with where we want to go, that directional focus, that's putting those two words together, right? The language that we use to produce or to describe that, right, should motivate people to take actions, should help with coordinating and aligning. See, I'm pulling words from those definitions, right? Without it, strategies can struggle to get activity behind them. If you're just talking about strategy in this sort of ambiguous way, then it's hard to actually implement, right? A good strategic vision should clarify the future, right? What do you want to be different from where you are now and or the past, right? How do we make that a reality? And then lastly, and I'll share more about this idea of it should tie directly to the big opportunity. So part of your conversation, as you're making sense through all this information, should lead you to an issue or a big opportunity that can be that catalytic mechanism. Here's an opportunity, let's move towards that because that gets us closer to the strategic vision that we set out, if that makes sense, right? So I forgot this slide was there, but so all of that, the two things we worked on so far is our mindset, and then we define some terms so that we now can have the conversation about how do we go about creating that with limitations of time, resources, and people, okay? So I have 12:37. Let's take 5 minutes. You can put yourself, take yourself off screen, stretch, take a bite, start recording again. Excellent. Let's get us back up here. Okay, so now what I like to do is sort of move us into those framework tools, right? To give us some sense of how to do some of that big stuff we were talking about earlier, the thinking, right? How do we move that into a practical space, right? Recognizing that you all still have decisions to be made. You still want to desire, have a need to do some strategic thinking or visioning. So how do we go about that? So I want to start with just naming. So again, back to my earlier point, I think in that creative slide, I frame these as curated things. These are things that I'm picking up along my travels, right? This is a journey. This work is a journey, right? And so this by no means is to say these tools, frameworks are the end all be all. You may have your own favorite tool that you really learn and gravitate and understand. Use it, right? Like again, what I'm hoping is that now in using it, maybe you can use it in a different way as a result of being part of this conversation. If you don't have frameworks, tools, and wisdom, you're more than happy, are more than welcome, excuse me, to use these that I'm suggesting, right? So the first will be just this framework from the Interaction Institute for Social Change out of Boston. I like it because it drills down and it simplifies the strategic planning process. We're going to start there. You should have received in the email this other handout called Edible Triage. And so I'm going to show you how you can use it as an assessment tool to determine your current reality. And I like it because there's some references around the pandemic. So any of you, as some of you have said already, still sort of figuring out how to move within the pandemic that we still find ourselves in, may find that helpful in determining your current reality. And then there's another handout tool, Nonprofit Business Model Canvas. That's an interactive tool, and I'm going to introduce that and show you how you can play with that to get done a lot of thinking, to incorporate a lot of different perspectives in a way that allows you to play before you make decisions. And then lastly, there's an action planning framework. And again, some of these, if you've been on some of my other workshops, I've used some of these tools in those workshops as well. So these tend to be my go-to in the context of framing and thinking about strategic planning, visioning, et cetera. So here is the framework from the Interaction Institute, right? And so if you can imagine, strategic planning really is three big buckets, right? Three big chunks of work that you accomplish in some time period, right? So one bucket is getting a sense of where are we now, right? So what I like to, that's that current reality circle here, right? Where are we now? How do we define that? Let's be as realistic, as honest underscore as we can, right? About where we are. Inside our organization, how our organization is situated with the community, feedback that we receive from the various stakeholders, et cetera, right? So that's a bucket. A second bucket is where do we want to be, right? So that's this idea of sort of goals of the process, but again, that's that vision that I'm talking about, right? So what I oftentimes like to do is have the where we want to be conversation first. And the reason why is because otherwise what tends to happen is you hedge, you lower your vision based on your current reality, right? And so what ends up happening is you don't shoot as far because you don't think you can get there because you're looking at where you're starting from. So to circumvent that, I'm like, we're going to talk about where we are, but let's talk about it in a way like that, imagining before the evidence. Let's talk about our future in a way of what do you desire? What's important? Where do you aspire to be? We'll figure out how to get there, right? But let's not be afraid to aspire, to dream, to think about however far out you want that to be, right? And so I tend to start the conversation there, right? And then once you do have those two anchoring points, where you want to be, where you're starting from, the connecting line between the two is this number 3. How do we get from here to there? And that's where you do your thinking, you make sense of the information you've gathered, you begin to make some decisions, and you begin to formulate strategy, right? What is strategy? Collective set, coordinated set, of actions, right? So our actions now begin to align and say, what do we need to do first to move us closer to this vision, right? So this is a very simple way to understand what may feel is something very big and complicated. It really isn't. It's 3 conversations. That's all it is. So when you think about it that way, now maybe it becomes a little bit more realistic to move these conversations into your day-to-day, right? Into your board meetings, right? What happens if we stop doing so much reporting and we have important conversations? Where are we? Where do we say we want to go? Oh, and how are we getting there? Are we doing that? That becomes a much different conversation. These other 2 up here are sort of contextual, right? So you want to always come into these conversations. Why is this process important right now? What do I mean by that? If you just picked up something and you said, well, we read we should have a strategic plan, that's not good enough reason for me. Let's give some thought. Why would strategic planning be important for you right now? Not just because you read something, like what impact can it have for your organization? Are any of these other things missing, right? Another one I hear oftentimes is, maybe this is the main one, our old strategic plan has run its course. So we had a 3-year strategic plan and we're in year 5. That's a common one that I hear. And so what I like to come back to is like, well, what happens if we don't put time on it? Meaning, you should only really be picking up strategic planning if you created a bigger vision and you're not there, and or your old strategies no longer work. So once strategy, whatever you were doing in the past, you started to feel like, okay, that's no longer working, or we seem like we have to work twice as hard, or we're not getting the same results. These are indicators that it's time to create a different strategy. Which means what? Which means we should pick up this strategic moment framework. Where are we? Where do we want to go? What's the pathway to get there, right? So you can ask some of these context questions. To the question that someone had asked earlier, who do we want to involve in the process? Who do we want to include in our thinking? Who are our stakeholders? What's important to them, right? And how can they inform our thinking? So this is a nice, clean, straightforward framework that allows you to take something that maybe you held as very complicated or took a lot of resources and work and time, and just sort of brought it down to a manageable way, right, to hold this work. 3 conversations, really 4 or 5 if you include a context. Why are we doing this in the first place? What do we want to get out of this process? What else is going on around us? Is there a big opportunity or not, et cetera, right? Who do we want to involve if we choose to do some strategic thinking, visioning, planning, right? And so there's that stakeholder conversations. And then once you launch, you're having these 3. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get from here to there? And you can decide if you feel like you already have a strategic vision, but strategy is no longer supporting that, then maybe you can start with this number 1. If you don't have a strategic vision, I strongly encourage you to pick up number 2 first and then go to number 1. Any questions on this one? Welcome to use it or not, completely up to you. So when we're thinking about, now I'm going to break each one of them down, right? So when thinking about current reality, right, it's extremely important, right, that you look at that from an empowering place, not as a judgmental, to beat yourself up, to have that we're not where we want to be conversation. We thought we were going to be further along conversation. That all may be true, right? But I want you to see this as an empowering act, right? Seeing things as they are, not as they should be, is a very hard thing to do. And I will actually say creating the vision is the easiest thing. Assessing and examining your current reality is much more difficult thing. Why? Because you're going to be working with different perspectives. You're going to be working with a general mindset that we tend to wear about framing certain things from the vantage point of what they should be, but not as they really are. We thought we would be here, but we're not. How come? What were the circumstances? What do we understand? But let's still celebrate where we are. We thought we were going to have a straight line to this next point of our organization. We found out that it's a zigzag road. All of that is okay. What did you learn? What did it mean? Right? So you're generally balancing two perspectives when you're looking at reality. What's happening around you, the ecosystem, the environment, trends that you're seeing, etc. Right? And then what's happening internally inside the organization with your people. Any questions on how you can hold current reality? Okay. Right. So again, if you have a vision, then you can start with current reality. If you don't have a vision, I would suggest you start with creating that. Where do we want to be? And then launch into your current reality. Both are needed to really move strategic planning, right? You need those 2 points to anchor. And then the through line is how you're going to get there, which is really about strategy. Right? So examining your current reality, looking what's happening in the world, the environment, the ecosystem, your neighborhood, your community, what's happening around you, what's going on, what are people talking about, right? And then internally, what's the health of your organization? What are your folks talking about? Is there this feeling of being burnt out, lonely, right? Because of the pandemic, isolated, right? Or we re-energize. I think someone was saying earlier, like we use this as a way to catapult, right? To recalibrate some work and then to move forward, right? So just getting a sense of what that energy feels like. Is everybody sitting with that? Right? Is everybody good and healthy within our organization? Are our practices working? What isn't working? What is working? What do we want to keep? What do we need to throw away? These are all kind of questions you can have to assess, right? To examine your current reality. And sometimes for the external one, you want, well, both really, right? You want to include other stakeholder groups to expand your frame, right? So you may want to talk to community. How can you do that? Maybe it's a survey. Maybe it's a focus group, right? Whatever is required. Maybe someone just produced, the city just produced a document and you can get your hands on that. And that document details the state of your community and city, right? The tremendous amount of investment goes into creating these reports. And then I wonder how do folks really use them, right? And so here's one concrete way. A recent report was done. Let's take that, let's look at that. What does that mean for our organization in terms of its reality? What is the external saying? And you do a similar process internally, right? Interviewing, having real conversations with staff, board, volunteers, with clients, constituents, or beneficiaries, getting their feedback, what's working, what isn't, what do you like, what you don't, what do you see as our strengths, what don't you see? All of that, right, falls into this conversation. Last thing I'll say about current reality, there's no such thing as perfect information. You can never know all the information. So don't set yourself up for that, right? Glean what you can glean, take in what you can take in based on your set of circumstances, and then move on. You'll learn more as you go, right? Some of you are familiar with the term analysis paralysis. You can get stuck trying to overanalyze all the information coming into your organization, right? So you set some parameters to say, let's take in what we can take. Let's try to make sense of that. And but the conversations we're having about that is moving towards creating action steps that get us to the vision that we have of some time in the future, okay? So that's what that current reality could look like. This is how you're engaging it, right? So here's again, just an example. So if we look at today, right now, what's happening, right? So we know we're still somewhat in the COVID-19 pandemic. We also, if we look a little bit broader, or maybe even in your local space, there's been an ongoing onslaught of environmental natural catastrophes. That may change how you engage and do some of your work. And some of you may be in that work, right? So you can even speak to that even more so. We know that we're in a climate of what folks are framing as this racial justice reckoning. I'm underlying the reckoning and I'm still putting a question mark. I hope, right? But I realize still a lot of work for us to do along those lines, right? But to the extent that that's a part of, or you were one of those organizations that created a response, a statement around race equity, racial justice, here's an opportunity to say, well, what's next? Or what have we done since we created the statement? Has anything moved, right? There's always local, state, national, global politics happening, right? Can't turn on the news. We just had preliminary or early races, right? Depending on where you are, right? And then there's that day-to-day that we talked about, right? So your own social, emotional, mental health. So all of these things are things that you can look at. And all of these things shape your current reality, right? And then here's some of the effects. So we know we're in a volatile space. We know the more we look at this stuff, the more uncertain we may become. Or you can be one of those people like, nope, I hear that, I see that, this is the direction I'm going, and all my effort is going towards that. So I'm going to predict, I'm going to create some certainty in uncertainty, right? How we embrace change. Things are moving, they're moving fast. We need to be able to adapt, pivot, turn on a dime. How do we leverage our ability, our size, if we're small, quote unquote, right, to make changes as we go? It's dynamic, it's not static, right? Time is dynamic, it's moving, right? A lot of things are happening and then there's turbulence, right? So these are just some effects that we may have, right, in the external world. And this is just an example of how you begin to look at your current reality using some of these prompts. Questions, comments, statements on any of that? How we doing, Yvette? You doing okay?
Doing good. Nothing in the chat so far.
All right, all right. Okay. So this triage tool, so I just took a snapshot of it on the screen. You actually have it. I know this may be hard to realize. So if we look at this previous slide as a way to explore external, right? That external perspective, this triage tool that I included, right? And this is just a snapshot, is a way to look internal, right? So if we look at a couple of these questions, is our organization deemed essential by stakeholders and our network? We like to think we mean something in this community. Have we checked? And here's a hard pill to swallow. And sometimes I relate it to accountability. Oftentimes we like say, well, we're accountable to the community. I say, oh, really? So let's explore what that means. So when we look at that, and if you offer that, I'm going to challenge that to make sure you understand what you're saying. So when you understand that, then it's less about if you think you're accountable and it's more about if the community thinks you're accountable, which means you have to engage the community, may take you outside of the organization to look in, right? Another way, and a more positive way of thinking about it, is sometimes you're so heads down in the work that you lose sight how important you are to a neighborhood, a community, or the work, right? How folks actually talk about you in your work, in your organization. Opportunities to even do more because folks want more, and they now, very important thing, you've cultivated relationships and trust with the community. So this is just a tool to explore some of those insights, and you can look at your mission, you can look at the health of your leadership, board, staff, executive, right? It gives you some questions. You can come up with your own, right? But I wanted you just to have a framework, right? It looks at the financial health. It looks at different dimensions within your organization. So this is just one tool of many that you can do a quick internal assessment. And again, I like this one because it talks about and it puts it in the context of COVID-19 as well. And what it allows you to do is rank as you're having these conversations. Oh, does this require emergent, like immediate action? Can we just set this as a priority? We give ourselves a little bit more runway. Is it non-urgent, right? Or do we need no action? Which means we shouldn't even be considering. That means it protects us from having these divergent or off to the side conversations when we're trying to build focus, right? We don't need to bring in information that isn't relevant. We don't need to bring in information that requires no action, right? So again, this is a tool that does a couple of things. Looking internal, right? So I gave you a framework for external, framework for internal. Both of those things help you determine your current reality. Thoughts, questions? Again, you have the whole tool. This is just a quick screenshot. This is not the whole thing, just so I can make reference to it. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Okay, I will move on. Another tool, and this is a tool that I like to use now in sort of that number 3, that middle. Let me go back just so you can reference. Right, so I'm making the assumption we set this. We just framed current reality. Now we need to connect the two. How do we get from current reality to our vision, our set of goals, and what have you, right? This tool allows you to play. So here's how I use it. I say, if you get a group of people, maybe it's that select few, or maybe it's a larger group, right? Again, you have the whole tool. This is just a snapshot of what it looks like. But you literally put this framework up on a big whiteboard or on a screen that folks can manipulate. And you go column by column, block by block, and you just ask and answer the questions. Who are our stakeholders? What type of relationship do we want to have with them? What ways do we engage? That's what channels mean. What ways are we connecting? What ways do we reach them? Is that the way that they prefer? So what some of you may have realized, I realized it for myself. I live in Philadelphia. Before the pandemic, 40,000 miles a year is what I put on my car traveling to do consulting work, usually in the Northeast, Connecticut, Boston, etc. Pandemic hit, I had to figure out a different way. I'm doing Zoom. Uh-oh, y'all didn't let me realize y'all accept the channel of Zoom. I don't have to do as much in person. I put 5,000 miles on my car in the last 2 years since the pandemic. All because, not necessarily driven by me, but because we're all in this space together. And I listened to the feedback to say, yes, by a decree, but also what we realized, we can have certain meetings, Roosevelt, and it's okay for us to be on Zoom. I still prefer to be in person, but we'll get there, right? But now I'll have a balance, right? But that's that channels conversation. How do you connect to the various stakeholders, right? There's a financial one on the bottom. You can't see it here, but you can see it on the sheet when you print it out. This left side is about what are the key activities? What key resources do we need, right? And this allows you to play. So the process is you ask the questions with a group of people, and if you have it up on a physical board, you get you some stickies, and you just start putting responses up in each category. Here's the beauty of this. Once you can kind of almost do it, it's also a tool you can use sometimes to determine your current reality. So what are our answers today to these questions? Then you can ask a question of, and I see, Naisha, that you raised your hand, so I'll come to you in a second. You can also use it as a way to say, okay, this is how we're thinking about it today, but now we've created this new vision. So what happens if we began to play with certain things? So if we move this and we change this, how does it relate to some of the other categories, right? If we change and we decide we want to have a different relationship with one of our stakeholder groups, What are the key activities that we need to do to facilitate that? Right? So this is how you can interactively use this tool and play to get some of that thinking out before making any commitments. Go ahead, Naisha, ask your question.
I just want to make sense of the previous tool in connection to this one.
Go for it.
Is that a linear process? Like how does what you do on the previous tool filter into this one? Or are you presenting them as these are just two separate tools to take you to somewhere else? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think the answer would be it's up to your brilliance and creativity, right? They can be both. They can be a linear tool. So if you building off of this triage tool, you'll be left with some information. Here's how we are. Here are some priorities. But now we need to look at this, right? What came out of this and maybe even our external assessment. We may need a container to put all that information, right? And this master key can serve as that container. So the answers you're getting to some of that current reality conversation may provide the answers to this, right? But then you now have them all up in all the aspects of your organization. So now when you move to the next conversation, how are we going to move from our current reality to our vision? You can begin to tank things off, put new things on, and see potentially how they'll play together. If we tweak this, if we create a different strategy here, what does that mean over here? So it allows you to do some of that predictive scenario planning type of conversation with that tool. Completely up to you if you want to combine, like leverage that, and or they can operate on their own. You may find this even as a more useful tool to ask current reality questions. You can use this in that way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
great. Any other questions? Thoughts, comments? So again, the simple process is blow this up or put it in a way that folks can interact and give some folks some stickies, or if you're using markers, I like stickies because you can put them up and you can take them off. Right? And it just allows you to just play. Remember that creative diagram I have? Play is important in thinking, right? This is non-committal right now, right? You're not committing to anything. You're just playing with the ideas, right? Where you're getting clarity, right? You're asking those clarifying questions. And then that allows you then to say, oh, well, we think we're envisioning an opportunity. Maybe there's a big funding opportunity that we can pursue. So our vision is to position our organization to take advantage of this funding opportunity because that creates some stability and sustainability and capacity to our organization to achieve our mission. I know that was a mouthful, but I'm running all of this together, right? And so then you may say, okay, well, who do we need to become? Where can we tweak in this middle space? What do we already have that maybe we can leverage, right? That are strengths that we can use to take advantage of this opportunity. So you can, again, you're only limited by your own imagination and creativity, your own desire to play with these tools, right? And to make some connections. Oh, we had this conversation, we learned this, let's integrate, let's incorporate that learning into this next tool, and now let's play with it. That makes sense? What do you all think? Helpful, maybe, maybe not. And again, the beauty of this is, if you can imagine, some of you all maybe are already have in your meeting planning structured retreats. You can do this in a day retreat and be ready for the next step, which is the actual action planning. What are we going to do first, second, third, set goals, etc. So you can knock this out in a day. I've done an exercise where we took 3 hours and we did what are we doing present day? So we filled this out based on knowledge, and then we did some visioning work. And then we came back to this and we said, based on the vision that we just created, what needs to change? How do we get to that vision? And folks started playing and moving things and all of that. There was all of this new learning. and then we landed on a process, and then we just moved them to, okay, and what's going to be the next step that we take? What are the next 2 or 3 steps that we can take in the next 100 days? And that was the process. And then you all there'll be some learning after the next 100 days. You incorporate that learning and you come back and say, what are the next 3 steps we can take? And what we've just done is shrunk that 6, 8, 9 month process into 3 hours worth of work. And the movement, the goal was for them to take action, right? By definition. So this is a tool that allows you to take the information that you've gathered through some current reality, or use it as a way to think about your current reality, and then play with it from a vantage point of, okay, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And then lastly, the final step in building sort of this process is then it's just about action planning after that. And again, I suggest you really narrow it down into chunks and bites that you can understand, take action, learn from those actions, and then move on, right? So it does require, okay, we've done all this exploratory work. Let's set a goal or 2 or 3, right? So this first question, what is our goal? What will it look like when we've accomplished it? So we have a goal, and we've given some thinking about what it will look like when we've accomplished that goal. Sometimes we call that indicators of success. Number 2, right? Okay, how do we see this helping with the unique needs of our beneficiaries, and how is this service of our mission? So this is a connection point. We're not just doing things random. It's a check-in to say, did we check in with folks? Did we engage our stakeholders? Is this consistent and in alignment with what we said? If we've done all that exploratory work, you've already gotten to a yes on that. If you haven't done that and you just went to this is a pause. We need to check in and see what the thinking is of our stakeholder groups. Or you can asking, are there any stakeholder groups missing from our initial assessment and analysis? Right? Then it's now we get into the step buildings. Where will we begin? What is the first or next elegant step that we can take? Breaking down the big thing, we know we want to get there. What's the first step? I like to say brick by brick. You all can't see it on my wall. I have a picture of the pyramids, right, in Egypt. And part of it, the picture that I have shows where weather has, destruct, so it's not a smooth surface, but you can actually see the bricks that are leading up to this great creation. And when I look at that and I meditate on that picture, I realize, how did they create that? Well, one, somebody had to have a vision, but then that vision motivated folks to do what? To build brick by brick, step by step. So imagine if you shrink the conversation down to, I want to make sure that my brick is laid in the best way that I can, and how that brick supports the next brick. This is how we get to those visions, right? And it's just asking, what questions are you asking? What conversation, to bring it back to our first point, what discussions, how are you holding this work? Again, who needs to be involved? Are we looking, is there an opportunity for collaboration, partnership? And who do we need to be communicating with? That's another check-in question. Again, it's checking your thinking to make sure you're not going too far in a vacuum. Most of you, if not all of you, have missions and visions in terms of what you want to do or how you want your work to impact said group. Most of those missions or visions are much greater and bigger than your single organization. So partnership and collaboration becomes a very real thing. It's embedded in your strategy, right? So now that means, well, we need to give conscious thinking about who are we connecting to, and what's the process, what's the strategies, what's the discussion for doing that. That's what this question allows you to do. And then 5, when? So what time frame are we giving? I just threw out arbitrarily. I like to break things down in manageable pieces, 100 days. What's the old adage? How do you eat an elephant? I don't suggest we try that, but you eat it one bite at a time. How do you build a pyramid? You build it one brick at a time. Right? And so what's the time frame we want to give to develop those bricks or to take those steps? And then lastly, hugely important, how are we communicating success, both internally and externally? We want to make sure that the people who are working day in, day out, right, have a moment to experience success. The question I like to ask, how can I celebrate you? Hugely important. It's motivational. It is part of the currency that feeds the nonprofit sector. We don't make a lot of money, if we make money at all, right? If we earn a paycheck, right? Many of us do this out of the love of our heart and the desire to have change. So it's important that we use a different currency to motivate, keep us going, right? To sustain our work. And celebrating success is one of those other currencies. So again, you may have a different framework that you use for asking questions to build the action steps, but I like these because it's pulling in all of the elements of the conversations we had prior, right? And then you get some things on paper and you take action. And you see what results from those actions. Sometimes that wasn't a good move. What do we learn from that? Oh, well, when we analyzed or we interpreted or we translated this, that was the wrong interpretation. What they really meant was this. You go back and you say, so we can recalibrate. Or you may have gained momentum and said, great, like everything that we thought we predicted, well, I was saying that earlier, it came true. Now what's the next action steps for the next 100 days or whatever time frame you put on it. So these are all curated tools to do the work. They work great together and they allow you to do those 1, 2, 3 actions, items in the IISC model, right? And this is all strategic visioning, planning is. If you have the time and energy and space and resources to do a much thorough, longer term plan, great. If you don't, no reason why you can't. What I've tried to share with you today is that you can literally do this in a matter of a week, a couple of days, a couple of hours, to be honest. And again, the goal is to move you to take action, and then you learn from that action and you put it right back into the system. You make sense of it. You let that inform your next move. You create those next moves. You decide on those next moves. You check in all these questions and you take a step forward. Thoughts, questions, comments. These are the tools that I've curated and suggested, but I want to give you space to ask about any of that or anything that we've covered up to this point before we close out. Amazing how time flies. How we doing, Yvette? Anything popping up? Any
Not
questions?
seeing anything in the chat so far, but please feel free to unmute or use the chat and we can definitely read out loud if you're not comfortable speaking out loud.
A lot of information. You got to have a question or two.
I
Hey,
know.
Naisha, it's great to see you again. 2 days in a row. I'll take that. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm soaking it all in. I couldn't tell you yesterday how much I just appreciate you. And so I'm back for more, but I don't, and that's my comment. It's just that this is all so rich and it needs time to marinate.
Definitely, definitely.
But it's just really good stuff and stretching your thinking and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm sitting right now.
Okay.
So thank you, Roosevelt.
You're welcome. Appreciate you.
So we do have some comments. Just thank you. Excellent information. A question about slides being shared. We will share slides after the session to all registrants. You'll also get the materials and tools that Roosevelt's been referencing throughout his presentation. So you'll have those as well. The prices, you got to fill out the survey. So we have some, just again, some comments. Wow, very informative, learned a lot. appreciation for the opportunity as a community board member that comes from Carrie. And is just saying thank you for a very helpful presentation. She's looking forward to using some of these time-saving tools.
Great.
And as you can see, Betsy has already shared the survey, so you can certainly click on it now and feel free to share your thoughts. Let us know how we can improve or keep giving you what works for you. And then Jadi wrote great information. Thank you.
Great, great. So no, I appreciate you all. I'll stop there and let you continue to close us out, Yvette. What I will say again is my real intent and hope is that you to Naisha's point, right? That you let it marinate, you take what you can take, right? And you take this information and let it propel you to take action. Like for me, all of this is, I hope it doesn't live on your shelf. I hope you actually find a way, right, to implement and use it and then learn from that experience, right? And then put that experience into your own recipe for how you can do this in real time with your organization and your work. Planning, thinking does not have to be this big, complicated thing, right? And hopefully that was the goal, really, to just demystify some of that, break it down into smaller chunks and say, you absolutely can do this. And you probably already are. It's just maybe you're not using this language, right? And so for those of you who are doing this, do more of it, right? And be more intentional about it. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Appreciate you all. And good luck in the rest of your working day. Go ahead, Yvette.
Just on behalf of our team, thank you for attending. A big thank you to Roosevelt, as always learning and feeding my mind. I always take notes. What stuck with me today, honestly, Roosevelt, just to share it on my part, is your use of the word play. Often that's not associated with work of nonprofits, but you really took us into a space and gave us some steps to do that while we do the most, what I think is the most important work that needs to be done. So thank you for that. Thank you for that energy and sharing your time and expertise with us today. Daniel will be sending, like I mentioned, the slide deck along with the link to the recording and the PowerPoints and the tools to all registrants. So look out for that in your email. If you don't get it, just email us. We'll get it to you. Also, look out for our next session, which is board member boot camp. It's going to be presented by May Maloney of Leadership Greater Hartford. It's also an excellent session. If you're interested, please register on the Hartford Public Library website. And again, if you can't find it, shoot me an email.
It will be on the email that I sent out this afternoon.
Thank you, Daniel. Very helpful. Also, just if this has spurred some thoughts about maybe some areas of support that your nonprofit might be looking for, might need a little more help with, or just to learn who's out there to help you with that issue or need, please, feel free to use us as a resource at the Hartford Foundation. I will share, actually, I'm sorry, I'm taking everybody. I should have had this in the chat already. But I'll share my email with you all here. So if there's anything that comes up after the session, feel free to email me and we can get started on trying to help you out. With that, thank you everyone for attending and have a beautiful day.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, guys.